My name is Beryl Miles. I'm the Dean of the Law School for those of you who are visiting with us for the first time. And it's so wonderful to see so many of our students come to today's program. It's a very special one. I was on the subway just yesterday or the day before, and there are some posters inside the subway noting this very historic day as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the wall coming down. And one of the riders on the subway said to me as he looked at the poster and he exited, "It's hard to believe. It's just 20 years." As I stood here for just a few minutes and thought about this, I realized that it's even a little more striking in terms of time for me. And I'll share something with you personally. My family went to Frankfurt, Germany when I was in first grade. And we stayed there for about 3.5 years. And of course, everything was in place then. And it's hard for me to just imagine how much time has gone by, but to have been able to witness the wall come down. And so we must never forget where we've been, where we have come from, and to think about where we're going to go in the future. I want to thank my colleague, Professor Ludwikowski, who's the director of our Comparative and International Law Institute here at Catholic University, and his colleagues from the International Foundation for Electoral Systems for putting this program on. And we must never forget, and we must always celebrate these wonderful occasions for our society throughout the world. I want to thank you all for doing this, and I want to thank all of you for being a part of today's program. I'm going to step aside, and I'm going to invite our Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, George Darby, to come forward and to begin the program and introduce all of our guests today. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dean Miles, very much. It's my pleasure to serve as moderator for the panel discussion this afternoon. The title of the event, as you know, is Commemorating the 20th Anniversary of the Fall of the Berlin Wall. It is a particular pleasure for me to participate in this event since I first visited Berlin, then a divided city, in 1987. Berlin was then a symbol of two competing social, political, and economic systems that dominated the last century. As we all know, the fall of the Berlin Wall represents much more than the reunification of the city of Berlin and the nation of Germany. The changes to the world order captured in the symbol of the fall of the wall were seismic in scope, but they presented challenges as well as blessings to the international community. Political democracy and relatively free market economics have not come instantly and easily. Our panel discussion today will walk us through the critical historical developments that led to the collapse of communism and the changes that have followed that historic event. Let me go through a very brief introduction of our speakers, and before the panel begins, we'll also have some comments and words from Mr. Sukolstowski from the Polish Embassy. But as I said, let me begin with just brief introductions, and then the panel can just go through the presentations. Our first speaker, we all know, is our colleague, friend, Professor Ludwikowski. Professor Ludwikowski brings to this presentation a wealth of experience that goes well beyond his his credentials as a preeminent scholar and student of the events that took place in Eastern Europe. He lived them. He holds 2 doctorates from a Polish university and has held 2 chairs at the Jagiellonian University, which is a sister school of ours, and at which we have programs of which we're very proud and for which we are indebted to Professor Ludwikowski. Professor Ludwikowski is, as most of you know, a very prominent scholar, the editor of a book on comparative human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the author of about 20 other books as well. The second speaker is Mr. Larry Wright. Larry Wright serves as a senior desk officer for Germany in the Office of Central European Affairs. He coordinates U.S. policy regarding Germany with primary responsibility for political and military affairs, as well as supervisory responsibility for economic and global affairs. His most recent previous assignments was as an energy officer in the Economics and Energy Bureau of the Department of State, where he was responsible for issues involving Eurasian energy production, such as in the Caspian Basin countries, Russia, and Norway, the means for transporting oil and gas to European and global markets, and EU energy security and interconnectivity issues. He previously served as a council officer from 2002 to 2004 at the U.S. Consulate in Frankfurt, Germany, and as the economic and commercial officer for the U.S. Embassy in Chisinau, Moldova, from 2004 to 2006. If you've read the written biography, I just wanted to add, I grew up in Chicago. It's the city of big shoulders and big hearts. We can forgive people who support the Tigers, the Lions, and the Red Wings. All right, but we appreciate his enthusiasm for his teams very much. All right, our next speaker is one of our own graduate of this law school, Mr. Chad Vickery. Chad Vickery has 11 years of legal and international elections administration experience with an emphasis on strengthening democracy and governance in transitioning societies. He has extensive experience providing technical assistance and support to elections and development of political processes in developing countries. Specific programmatic experience includes leading projects to ensure development of impartial legal frameworks for elections, increase professionalism of election management bodies, improve accuracy of voter registration lists, establish effective election dispute programs, and increase political participation of women and historically disenfranchised groups into the electoral process. Our final speaker this afternoon is Mr. Peter Urban, Senior Electoral Advisor, Country Director for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems in Pakistan. Mr. Urban is one of the world's foremost electoral experts, specialized in democracy promotion in post-conflict transitional and developing countries. He is current country director for IEFES in Pakistan. He has previously been the chief electoral officer and election commissioner in Kosovo and Afghanistan. During the past 18 years, Mr. Urban has led missions to and held senior electoral positions in Bosnia, the Palestinian territories, Nepal, Lebanon, East Timor, Iraq, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. A great deal of experience indeed. I could go on for a great deal of time introducing these speakers. They're very distinguished, but I think you now have a sense of the quality of the talks we're going to be receiving. Let me now turn the podium over to Mr. Sulgostovsky, who can make a few comments representing the Polish embassy.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Dean, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for this kind invitation and for the idea of commemoration of 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall through this panel organized under the auspice Columbus School of Law. My generation experienced life behind the wall, as well as witnessed a long process of transformations and the erosion of the system in the former Soviet bloc. Do not make mistake that I look young. It is just a matter of appropriate maintenance. Okay. The collapse of the Berlin Wall 20 years ago marks a symbolic moment in the history of Europe and the world. But as we look back at the joyous act of the evening of November 9th, we have to point out that the historic movement that swept the nations of the Eastern and Central Europe and reached the culminating point by dismantling the wall started much earlier in Poland. The formation of the independent labor union called Solidarity in 1980, headed by Lech Wałęsa, and the political upheaval it had caused in the struggle for democracy and freedom ignited a series of revolutions in Eastern Europe. So-called the Round Table talks between Solidarity and the communists led to the first partially free election in Poland in June 1989, and then later paved the way for the change. The wise, inspirational thoughts of Pope John Paul II, shared with us during his visit to his native land, reminded Poles that we had the right to self-determination, gave us the hope and the moral support we desperately needed. What has followed in a lengthy process of political and economic transition in Central and Eastern Europe, as Poles, we fully recognize that this democratic revolution and the transition that followed would not have been possible without the invaluable support of United States administration and its citizens. Our current strong bilateral ties with the United States are a testament to this. However, while some nations have been successful in these transformations, others continue their work and require further support and attention. Professor Leszek Kołakowski, the Polish famous philosopher, once said, "Freedom is always vulnerable, and its cause is never safe." While the Berlin Wall was easily dismantled in the months that followed, other walls continue to exist, even still in on European continent. These walls should be seen in a deficit of democratic values, weak civil societies, and the lack of economic stability, witnessed in several nations, including some bordering Poland. The collapse of these walls is a prerequisite of the welfare, stability, and security of the entire European continent. In this regard, Poland will continue to play a critical role, offering support to its neighbors that may integrate them fully with the West. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The panelists will now give their presentations in the order that I introduced them, and I will let them know when they're starting to run out of time. But let us begin with Professor Ludwikowski and his presentation on this issue.
Thank you, Dean Miles. Thank you, Dean Garvey. And many thanks to Council Surgostovsky for emphasizing that actually the crisis of communism began long before the Berlin Wall fell. Well, it is the event, probably one of the most important in our life. It ended, or almost ended, Cold War. It preceded a little bit the collapse of the heavy empire, as Reagan called the Soviet Union, and the disintegration of the socialist bloc. Well, the process started many years before the war really collapsed. In 1982, I left Poland when martial law was imposed, and shortly after that, I was invited by the Stanford University to give a lecture on the situation in Poland. Actually, the title, the topic was, "Will the crisis of communism begin in Poland?" And, well, one of the points which I tried to make was, no, it started long before Solidarity surfaced, the trade union in Poland, but obviously Poland, well, events in Poland and many upheavals of Polish intelligentsia and workers and students were actually contributed to the crisis of communism. At the end of the lecture, or actually in the time of questions and answers, some colleagues of mine from Stanford University made this comment, well, what this crisis really, what does it mean? Communism survived many periods of crisis, and one of the commentators have jokingly said, well, maybe you will go back to Poland and see what is the situation with Solidarity now when martial law was imposed. Well, after the lecture, I began asking myself some questions. When I began believing that, well, we are close to the end of this communist story, and the crisis is real. Now, that is, it doesn't mean only temporary problems. It means some distortions and errors, some issues, some problems which were inherent in communist ideology, communist system itself. I believe that I remember one of these moments when I thought to myself, the crisis is real. Let me tell you a little bit about it. It was 1979, and I was still sitting in my office at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and it was the day when Pope John Paul II arrived to Krakow. And he was supposed to pass in the street pretty close to my office, well, near Jagiellonian University. And I came to the window and looked downstairs at an enormous crowd of people. And what I saw, it was really amazing for me. The common people were throwing flowers on the street, but there were a couple of policemen and soldiers and guards, security guards, on their knees, arranging these flowers on the street. And I thought to myself, my goodness, 10 years ago, the same guys were beating our students and us as well during some events where we protested or demonstrated against the communist system. Now they are on their knees, and they are with the crowd of people, with the university professors, students, workers, all together. And, well, in this moment, one of my colleagues, in quotation marks, the secretary of party in the university entered my room and asked whether he can look through the window as well. I knew that he wanted to take notes how many faculty members are in the crowd down there. So I left him. I was not a party member, so it was not threatening my position at the university, and I joined the people on the street. In the moment when Pope was passing in his Papa Mobile, the window next to my office opened, and some students showed the banner saying, "Viva Pope, Viva Pope," and they began screaming loudly, "Stay with us, stay with us." And the journalists took the picture of these two windows, and in the evening news in TV, we could see the students screaming and welcoming Pope, and at the next window, this pale face of the secretary standing there. It was symbolic for what was happening. It is where a period of, I would say, isolation started. Isolation of this party nomenclatura, people from everybody else in the country. Well, let me elaborate a little bit on these factors which contributed to the crisis. I would be able to go on, but let me focus or emphasize a couple of those. Well, it was the time when communist ideology was dying, where all of us realized that all these cliches about collective mentality of the people, about the democratic centralism, about the constructive self-criticism, that these are just slogans, but commonplaces, cliches. There was nothing like collective mentality. Well, collective mentality was supposed to mean that if the people raised in a communist system see the colliding values, collective and individual, they will always select and protect collective values. It was not true that people are human beings, and no one, or almost no one, cared about these collective values, maybe about communal values, but not collective values. And, well, no one really cared about dictatorship of proletariat. There was no dictatorship of proletariat. There was only dictatorship of the party, not proletariat. Well, there was nothing like democratic centralism, which meant that initiatives come from grassroots of society and decisions are taken by leaders of the party. Well, there were no initiatives coming from grassroots. We knew it. Well, there was a group of yes men selected through so-called negative selection. They were compliant. If they say yes to their party leaders, they were doing fine and supporting the system. Without these party leaders, the system could not survive. With them, it could not be reformed, and it badly needed reform. We observed that moral crisis followed the ideological crisis. Moral, because the people became extremely corrupted. They do not believe that if they are taking a piece of this common cake, that they are doing something wrong. No, they were not stealing. It was no one's property. They were taking something what would belong to nobody. Well, this moral crisis corroded the societies and resulted in economic crisis. Actually, the leaders selected through this process of negative selection, they were clever, but they were not smart. They were sometimes, and most often, they were ignorant. We called this system dictatorship of ignoramuses. They did not care about the system. They were collecting arguments which would help them personally. Well, I would identify three major stages in this decay of communism. The first one, it was the stage of denunciation, the stage when a group of relatively courageous dissidents and intellectuals, they tried to analyze the system, some basic premises of the system, and well, they ended up with conclusions that the system cannot recover. It is like a river without no return, that it may not collapse next day, but it cannot be improved or cannot be, the problems cannot be cured. Well, it was the time of reformism in in socialist countries where people believed that the system can be cured from inside. There was some optimism even among these dissidents and rebels. Some claimed that the system may be reformed from outside. Well, basically, it was the period when conclusion was no. The problems of the system are irreversible. It was followed by stage of awareness when it was the conclusion not only those who openly protested and were dissidents in this system, but the common people who understood that, well, there is no retreat from these problems. And the last stage, it was the stage of isolation, which I tried to show you through this story in the very beginning. The picture of this pale face of party secretary standing behind the glass window separating him and many people like him from other people. Let me end up with one comment or one couple of words. I ask another question to myself. Well, I believe that crisis is real, that the problems are irreversible. I asked whether the system will collapse, really. And I remember the moment when I was leaving Poland, martial law was imposed, and I was pushed out from the country. And in the last day before my departure, I was driving through the city pretty close to Krakow. The name is Nowa Huta, New Steelwork. Actually, the communist governments built or created this new city just to counterbalance influence of intellectuals, intelligentsia in old Krakow, which was cultural capital and is cultural capital of Poland. And when I was driving along the walls of the steelwork, I saw the inscription on the wall. It started with the words, "Proletarians of all countries," and I expected that it would end up unite, as Marx said. I stopped the car, and I saw a couple of policemen just with a bucket of paint, white paint, trying to cover this inscription. I looked and I was so surprised. Why just the holy words of Karl Marx were to be covered by good policemen, good comrades? And the mission was impossible because the black letters were still coming through this white paint. And so they jumped into the car and they left. And in that moment, the door to the gate to the steelwork opened, and the group of workers jumped out and they began painting these letters again with black paint. I was driving and I realized what the inscription said. Proletarians of all countries, forgive me, Karl Marx. And well, I believe that the end and the collapse is near. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for all of you for inviting me to come here today. I just wanted to start looks like we have a fairly young crowd, so I guess that probably most of you were not around when the Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961. Is that right? How many remember when it came down in 1989? Okay, about half. How many people weren't even alive when it came down? No? Okay. Okay, so one of the challenges we face in U.S. foreign policy with Germany these days is that an entire generation, now that it has been 20 years, have grown up without the Berlin Wall and don't realize what it represented, what a divided Germany meant, and what it was like to live during the Cold War, and what it meant to live under when a quarter of Germans were not free. And this also means that they don't, one of the challenges for American foreign policy is that they also don't remember the role that the United States played in the post-war period. They don't remember the Berlin airlift in 1948 and 49 when American and British and French pilots basically saved Berlin from a siege, from a stranglehold that the Soviets had imposed in a blockade around Berlin in attempting to wrest that island in the middle of the German Democratic Republic from control by the other three Allied powers. And they don't remember the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Germany. And they don't remember John F. Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner speech, when he challenged the world to let them come to Berlin and to see that freedom could prosper in the midst of the repression of Eastern Germany. And as my colleagues pointed out, November 9th, 1989 was sort of the middle of a process throughout Central and Eastern Europe when communism began to collapse and did collapse in that region. And just my own personal recollections was I was much like many of you. I was in graduate school at the time at the Russian and East European Institute at Indiana University and studying about Eastern Europe. And between when I left my first year of studies in May 1989 and when I came back in September of 1989, things had radically changed. The roundtable discussions in Poland had begun in June. And on August 23rd, 1989, Hungary opened its border with Austria. And that basically began the process which culminated in the end and the collapse and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Because what happened was East Germans, of course, were able to travel freely, or relatively freely, I suppose, among their fraternal socialist brethren in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, the Soviet Union. So many of them went on vacation to Hungary, and then when Hungary, because of the forces that were unleashed in Poland and as they began to spread like dominoes falling throughout Eastern Europe, Hungary made the decision to open its border with Austria, which then was very much a neutral country, still governed by a treaty signed in 1955, the Austria State Treaty, which guaranteed Austrian neutrality in return for ending the occupation of Austria by the four Allied powers. They made the decision to open their border with Austria, which then made it possible for East Germans to take a vacation in Hungary and then go across the Hungarian-Austrian border, and then, of course, from Austria into across the Austrian-West German border. So it was a giant end-around play that unleashed the forces of emigration from the east to the west, and that made an irresistible force that the German Democratic Republic was forced to reckon with. It was when Soviet leader Gorbachev then came to Berlin for the 40th anniversary celebrations of the founding of the GDR in 1989, and basically told the East German leadership that he was not going to intervene. On November 9th, which history will now remember as the fall of the Berlin Wall, it came as a mistake. The Politburo in the GDR had made the decision that they were going to allow travel to West Berlin and to West Germany without requiring visas, but this was going to take effect on November 17th, which would be today, actually. But at a news conference on November 9th, the government spokesman, the propaganda minister, actually got his notes confused, and he said that made the announcement that this policy was going to take effect. Somebody said had been decided. somebody asked the question of when does it take effect, and he was confused. He didn't have any guidance. He said, well, I suppose it takes effect immediately. That was broadcast on the evening news, and immediately, joyous East Berliners and began flooding across the checkpoints into West Berlin. First, as you may have seen last week, across the bridge, and one of those, of course, was an East German physicist named Angela Merkel. And she came across on that bridge, and along with many others. And then later that evening, as the flood of East Berliners into the West Berlin became more than the border guards could withstand, they began going through the other checkpoints and dancing on the wall, as we all have seen in the very popular photos. Of course, this wasn't the end of the process either. Today we also celebrate the 20th anniversary of the beginning of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. It's a holiday for both Czechs, now after the Velvet Divorce, two independent countries, Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. But today marked the beginning of a peaceful demonstration that was repressed by the authorities, which then snowballed out of control for the communist authorities in Czechoslovakia, led to the creation of the Civic Forum, and many led by a playwright named Václav Havel, who encouraged, much like others in the other East European countries, that this was going to be a peaceful demonstrations, kept the movement peaceful, and therefore we have what we call the Velvet Revolution, because when the communist authorities finally realized again that they had no support and they were not going to get any support from Moscow, they allowed elections to take place, which then led to Havel being elected the president of Czechoslovakia in December of 1989. But of course, also in December of 1989, there was one revolution in Romania that was not peaceful. It was extremely violent. And I remember this well because I was a student of Romanian language and focused many of my studies on Romania in 1989. And again, this is one where when I left for Christmas vacation, it seemed that Romania was going to be the one holdout in Eastern Europe that did not fall in this tide of popular demonstrations that the Ceausescu government and the Securitate secret police were so strong and so entrenched and so repressive, and the people were so poverty-stricken. It was the poorest country in Europe by several measures. People would have only one 40-watt light bulb in order to light their homes, but in a town in western Romania, in Timișoara, December 17th, 1989, a peaceful demonstration became violent, was repressed by the secret police, and the people fought back. And a few days later, the movement spread to Bucharest, the capital, and the dictator Ceausescu was giving a speech from the balcony in a central square, and the crowds that he had gathered, thinking that this would be once again another propaganda piece, another show of support for his cult of personality, suddenly turned against him and started chanting, instead of Ceausescu și poporul, Ceausescu and the people, they started chanting Ceausescu e dictatorul, Ceausescu is a dictator. He wasn't able to control the crowd and fled to the roof, flew off in a helicopter, and that gave the people courage to take matters into their own hands. But again, the Securitate secret police was pervasive in society, not only it was an intelligence service, but also a well-armed military force. But the army, mostly conscripts, took the side of the people, and that's how the Romanian Revolution became so bloody. It basically became the army versus the security services. Ceausescu's helicopter pilot turned against him, turned him in, and that's what led to basically a show trial on Christmas Day, December 25th, when he and his wife, who was equally hated, were executed by a firing squad, and eventually, Romania slowly but surely also became a free and country, and now is a NATO member and an EU member, much like all of the other Central and East European countries that we now mark their independence and their freedom. Let me just stop there with sort of the memories, my memories of 1989. I hope that's illustrative of some of the things that were occurring in addition to what was going on in Poland. Let me just talk a little bit in the last couple of minutes about what it has meant, because there was a lot of resistance, you might remember, because now in my current position on the Germany desk, I recall that there was a bit of resistance to a united Germany, even in 1989, 40 years after, more than 40 years after the end of the Second World War. There was still a fear that a united Germany could return to some of the horrors of the second half of the entire 20th century, but primarily during the World War II. And it was the United States that was the one that firmly backed a united Germany. And today we find ourselves almost in a dilemma that we need to continue to encourage Germany to be united, and now that it is united, to be strong and to take a leadership role, because no one understands its history better than the Germans do. And they are reluctant to take a global leadership role. They are reluctant to commit troops abroad, even when it is serving a common purpose and under a NATO or a UN mandate. There's still a very strong cultural aversion to German troops serving abroad, and so we are working very closely with Germany in places like Afghanistan, where they are starting to break out of that shell, and really are serving a valuable and honorable purpose, taking ownership, so to speak, of one of the northern region of Afghanistan. And this is something that we are working on in the context of broadening and reinvigorating the German-American relationship. So, and again, we still have a lot of work to do, as I said, with reaching that next generation of Germans, to ensure that the ties that have historically bound the United States and Germany, nearly a quarter of all Americans have German ancestry. We had a very close relationship in the 19th century. We have at times had very strong relationships in the 20th century, and of course in the latter half, the U.S. relationship with the Federal Republic of Germany was extremely strong. But we now need to take that next step and look to the future and see how we can translate our common values into common goals that we can then together achieve. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Well, I think it's very interesting, the discussion of the historical aspects of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think Peter and I's experience, and mine in particular, is after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was a very young man when the Berlin Wall fell, and my experience was mostly on television, probably like many of you. And so I think Peter and I and IFAS in general have been living in the real world of what happens after the fall of the wall and what democracy means to people all around the world. The symbolism of the wall falling and democracy rising from its debris is a powerful symbol. 20 years later, though, it's fair to say that the march towards free and effective democracy around the world is still only beginning. The wall is seen as the key symbol of democracy's victory over communism, but is at the end of history, not by a long shot. We have to remember both sides of the Cold War built walls. The free world built its own structures, including friendly dictators and entrenched dominance of elites friendly to U.S. interests. These walls have not fallen as rapidly as the walls built by the communist model. We need little reminder that democracy promotion was not a much-used foreign policy tool during the Cold War, at least not for democracy as an end in and of itself. However, there was an explosion of democracy conversions in the 1990s, especially in Eastern Europe and Africa. At the same time, spending increased rapidly on democracy promotion assistance in the U.S. Funding went from $165 million in 1991 to $635 million in 1999. These funds were widely distributed across all regions of the world. Democracy assistance, however, began to reverse course after 2000. Popular dissatisfaction with democratically elected governments, economic mismanagement, and a sense of nostalgia for the former Soviet Union, along with stagnation of democracy promotion funding through levels in the Congress associated with democracy promotion. And in countries besides Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a lead of skepticism towards democracy promotion and democracy in general. There have been several mistakes made in democracy promotion projects. For example, according to Thomas Carruthers, from 2000 on, U.S. foreign policy became a relentless association of democracy promotion with the Iraq War. And regime change, the goal of spreading democracy, was a positive one, but the means were all wrong. The focus on democracy promotion in the Iraq context led to the popular misconception that the U.S. has funneled enormous sums of funding into elections, which has actually undermined legitimacy and security. However, it is a lack of good governance in recipient countries where elected officials fail to provide basic services to the electorate, and not the elections themselves that undermine legitimacy. The diversity of funding has engendered misconceptions. The U.S. has supported elections through diplomatic engagement, technical assistance, and election monitoring, but election funding itself is hardly dominant. It equals less than 20% of overall democracy assistance. That is, most of the democracy promotion funding the U.S. provides goes to important areas such as the rule of law, promoting civil society, civic education, strengthening parliaments, and the like. It is important to recognize that President Bush did overstate the importance of certain elections, like the 2005 election in Iraq. But that does not mean that election assistance as a rule is the sole focus of democracy promotion, or that it should be. According to Carruthers, no U.S. democracy promotion group bases its actions around the idea that elections equal democracy. Despite this, many observers believe that the U.S. has pushed elections too hard in politically shaky and developing countries, and that we should back away from electoral support and concentrate more on fundamental elements like the rule of law and an effective state. Of course, the rule of law and providing basic services are cornerstones of stable nations. However, we cannot walk away from elections as they are the best mechanism available to legitimize governments and are an integral part of the many aspects of democratic consolidation. Specifically, frequent elections can, and in some cases, force governments to practice better governance, especially in the area of economic policy. In short, genuine elections promote accountability over time. Although it would be naive not to recognize the fact that elections may encourage some leaders to undermine rule of law by trying to steal elections, but international assistance can be conditional and structured in a way to keep elections honest. As Paul Collier notes, election assistance supported by donor requirements for transparency and a willingness to protect democratically elected governments from being overthrown can be a stabilizing force. A few specific and recent examples may be instructive of why elections and elections assistance remain important and potentially stabilizing for transitioning countries. Democratic participation in war-torn countries like Iraq is a testament to how much people want democracy, even under the threat of violence. In addition, many of those skeptical of supporting election assistance point to the violence in Kenya, which was horrendous. But as Carruthers points out, another part of the story is that the country had moved ahead democratically enough that manipulated elections can no longer be carried off without significant counter-reaction. Furthermore, elections are regularly and successfully taking place in democracies around the world. One example is Indonesia, a relatively young democracy with a population of over 230 million. It has limited experience in democratic elections and democratic transfers of power. Although assistance has decreased considerably since the first election in 1999, U.S. aid has allowed organizations like IFAS to assist the Election Commission and other organizations to prepare for the 2009 legislative and presidential elections. In addition, U.S. leaders have made it clear that in their statements that this democracy is important to U.S. interests, giving the Indonesian government a strong incentive to accept and further the democratic outcomes of these elections. A presidential election in a huge, scattered, ethnically and religiously diverse country such as Indonesia with minimal democratic experience could be a recipe for disaster. However, buttressed by years of assistance, the rule of law and governing institutions were sufficiently strong to deal with presidential candidate complaints in a prompt, efficient, and globally recognized way. In short, although the 2009 elections in Indonesia were complex and imperfect, the country never developed into true crisis, and there was no major violence, which is an astonishing thing considering the ethnic diversity in Indonesia. As we look back at the fall of the Berlin Wall, the international community must take this time to reaffirm the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 21, which states everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. Furthermore, democracy promotion as an endeavor informed by research and experience has strengthened over the past 20 years. The Indonesia example highlights the fact that various aspects of democracy assistance are mutually reinforcing. Elections, strengthened institutions and good governance, rule of law, and judicial independence all protect individual rights, such as the right to vote, to gather freely, due process of the law, and otherwise participate in governance. We haven't always promoted these aspects of democracy and good governance, though. One legacy of the Cold War policy throughout the world is endemic corruption, rent-seeking and state capture by elites, lack of informed citizenry, weak rule of law, oppressive policies that uphold the unitary state, etc. The process of deconstructing those walls is a slow process. However, the deconstruction of these walls can be hastened through wide-ranging democracy, development assistance. It's not the time to back away from this fundamental endeavor. With that in mind, and at this time of remembrance of the wall, the Obama administration should continue to focus on democracy promotion, including the mutually reinforcing programs in the area of election assistance, rule of law programming, and other initiatives to promote and support good governance. Of course, assistance should go to hot spots like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan, but also countries like Indonesia, which have made great strides, but there's still a need for continued support to achieve true democratic consolidation and to prevent backsliding. As Madeleine Albright recently said, in the long run, we cannot prosper or even be safe in a world where democratic values are under siege. While critics have suggested that freedom begets chaos, history shows it is the denial of liberty that most frequently ends in conflict and war. And it is with that very short speech that I want to just say that my colleagues at IFAS have worked in this area many places, many times under fire, literally. It's a humbling experience to be involved in the electoral process and to see people all over the world live through that process and to believe in it. And that's what the the Berlin Wall means to me, and I believe many of my colleagues at IFAS. Thanks.
I hope it's not because of me that people are leaving. Exactly. I shall endeavor to try and keep people relatively interested. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I'd like to take a slightly different perspective on the issue of the fall of the Berlin Wall and talk a little bit about democracy and the obstacles that I see to this around the world today. The fall of the Berlin Wall offered great promise for the proliferation of human rights and for democracy way beyond Eastern Europe. Many thought that we would enter into a time where the desire for freedom, spurred by the events in Berlin, would naturally tear down other authoritarian regimes around the globe and spread democracy more widely. Initially, we were all encouraged by the colored revolutions that have been mentioned by other speakers today that swept through the former Soviet Union, but our hopes were somewhat premature. We came to admit that the words of a great pragmatic philosopher, Winston Churchill, were still valid. It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all others that we have tried. Since shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, for almost 20 years, I have traveled the world trying to help further peace, stability, human rights, and democracy. Sadly, I believe we have not been as successful as we had hoped for. I'm aware that scholars have very complicated academic explanations for why democracy promotion has proven difficult. But being only a simple practitioner, I'd like to share a few simple thoughts on what walls are in the way of offering all people their human rights today, and within these human rights, the right to participate in a real democracy and the right to cast a genuine vote. The fall of the Berlin Wall represents a very visual and tangible victory for democracy. The walls we're trying to tear down today are more intangible, often not even recognized by the very people they so deeply affect. I'd like to talk about two walls that I see every day in the work that I do around the world. First and foremost, the wall between cultures, particularly manifested in the rising tension and wall between the Christian and the Islamic world. I am personally deeply concerned about the rising tension between these two dominant cultures, about our inability to understand each other, to reconcile our differences, to be tolerant, and to develop a model to coexist. The wall between us is now so high that neither group can peek over it and with their own eyes see how people actually live lives on the other side. They do not understand that we share many values, even if we carry out our lives in very different ways. Both groups are misinformed by forces that thrive and profit on fear and conflict. Both groups are being misled by mass media's blatant pursuit of sensationalism. I have lived most of my grown life in the Islamic world. Today I live in Islamabad, and I live there very happily with my little family. For the first time in the 18 years I've been out, my family, particularly my mother, now calls me regularly and shows much more concern than she did previously when I lived through the wars in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And I've offered why that is. It is partly because we have such an imbalanced, or we increasingly have an imbalanced perception of the places where these conflicts go on. Many think that Pakistan is a place where there are only extremists living, where intolerance towards our culture is spreading rapidly or is completely dominant. And I believe that we are making a huge mistake in the way that we look at other peoples today, in that we judge these people by the actions of a few, namely the few that make it to the front page of the media and whose actions very often show themselves quite vividly in attacks throughout the world. Fortunately enough, if we look at Pakistan, the people that I live among are actually extremely peaceful people. They're people that want many of the same things we want. They want democracy just like we want it. They're being haunted by a very small group of people that pursue extremism. And we're very fortunate that in our work in Pakistan today, we're actually seeing over the last year a deepening resistance towards the undemocratic and inhuman methods of the extremists. And what people forget to know is that Pakistanis now widely want to see that democracy succeed, widely want to be part of the fight against Taliban and against Al-Qaeda. While having seen this change, it is with very deep concern that I at the same time see that the Pakistani people are fiercely against the United States, partly because the United States is being demonized to a degree where the Pakistani people don't really understand that we would like to contribute to the future peacefulness and stability inside Pakistan. And we have, again, here a huge challenge in front of us to overcome these misunderstandings in how we are being perceived around the world. I'm also lucky to live for a number of years and work on the Palestinian conflict. I lived both in Ramallah and in Jerusalem. And obviously, here's a very concrete wall that I saw come up, which I again think signifies some of my concerns and the divisions between our cultures. In fact, from my window in Jerusalem, I could see the wall being built right through the property of my Arab neighbors. I fundamentally understood the Israeli need for security, as I often was far too close to suicide bombs going off in the city. But I could also easily see how my Palestinian friends were being affected by these barriers rising up around them. I believe that we need to address the conflict in the Middle East if we should have any hope to address the conflict that we have between our cultures at this point. And I think that if we do not, in the near future, find a way in which we can move forward on the Middle East conflict, we will find it very difficult to lower the wall and be able to shake hands between the cultures that I have mentioned today. In our field of work, elections, we see many manifestations of these differences between cultures. Maybe the most important one is that elections is increasingly being painted by extremist groups as a Western ideological invasion, while truly the vast majority of Muslims want to have a say in their own government. We need to turn this tide and make sure that the desire for democracy is clearly seen as coming from the people itself as opposed to being the ambition of an outside intruder. The second wall that dominates my work is the very clear social inequality between and within nations, the gap between rich and poor people. Firstly, I believe that the disparity between nations, between the so-called developed and the developing world, is a root problem to the conflicts that we see today and seriously stand in the way of making democracy work. I think there's a building resentment amongst the so-called poor nations against the Western world for what they see as us having so much more than they have. I think that mass media carries a lot of responsibility for this. First and foremost, it is widely available to poor people throughout the world, and mass media often misrepresents the difference that we have in income level and vastly fail to describe what is the reason for this, often blaming us, the Western nations, for this disparity. Every day I go walking on the mountainside in Islamabad, and I see little children that come running over from the Red Mosque's madrasa, the religious school that was the root of one of the shootouts in Islamabad a couple of years ago. And obviously I find madrasas and religious education a terrifying, an absolute terrifying concept. But I have just had children myself, and I worry about them and how they will survive in this world, how they will be schooled and so forth. And I can easily see why parents that have absolutely nothing to offer their children because of poverty, why the promise of a madrasa where they can put their children and they are taken care of, fed, and taught, while not the curriculum we would like, but taught a curriculum throughout their young years, why that is a very, very tempting opportunity. And when I see these children come out from the madrasa, well-clad, well-fed, and when I know that there would be no food for them if they had stayed at home in many cases, it is easy to see how this social inequality is fueling new generations and their extremism. I also believe that we've seen nations being torn apart by the difference in income within the nation. And I think a good example is that Nepal, where I have just recently worked, where we saw the Maoist movement be very successful both in the field of battle but also later in the field of policy. It was very clear that the Nepalis are not Maoists by nature. They hardly understand what Maoism actually believes. But the Maoist represented somebody that was willing to recognize the social inequality in Nepal and wanted to address this and try and change things for the people. And I believe that the Maoist is a clear product of the social inequality that we have been so enabled to address around the world. Now, I also think that the social inequality unfortunately lead to that it's very, very difficult to implement democracy for the simple reason that the very small elites that there are in these countries are so strongly holding on to the power and the access to resources that they have. And I think that corruption, both of financial and of political nature, is one of the main reasons that we're failing around many of these countries in truly reforming them and bringing a better democracy about. Working in Pakistan, I see every day that reforms are not being embraced because effectively they would mean that the very, very tiny elite would have to give up power and would have to live with the uncertainty that democracy does represent, would have to submit their own destiny to the will of the significant masses that have so little in the country. So I also believe that the social inequality, the difference between rich and poor, has entrenched many of the regimes, the political elites around the world in the countries that we're so worried about, and makes it extremely difficult for us to actually improve circumstances in those countries. And there are plenty of examples of these. Pakistan is merely one where we battle with an elite that have no intention of truly embracing democracy. Democracy will only thrive if opposing cultures learn to tolerate each other and if the monumental problem of social inequality in the developing world becomes a priority on the agendas of our leaders in the Western world. Breaking down walls does take time. It is my hope that it is merely undue impatience that makes me concerned for the future of democracy. It is my hope that we will have the will, the wisdom, the resources, and the time to make democracy the fundament for stability and prosperity for future generations. I think democracy has great promise, but I still think we have a long way to go. Thank you.
Wonderful. We have about 15 minutes, and the presenters have agreed to take some questions. Anyone have a question for the panel or specific panel members? Yes, please.
We now know that after the unification, there was a huge skepticism in the Western world. In France, François Mitterrand, the Margaret Thatcher, England. How was it debated in Poland after the unification? Was it a joyful event that the communism was falling, or was it a huge threat is emerging again, and in Germany? And what assurance the U.S. had when it was backing from the beginning of the unification without any hesitation? That's what I know. What was that assurance from the United States that happened?
I'll take the latter part of the question first, and then I'm actually interested in how the reaction in Poland was. I would just say it was the strength of the institutions that we knew that democracies are not threats to other democracies, and that a democracy was firmly established in the Federal Republic of Germany, and that there was no danger of any of the fascist or dictatorial systems ever going to take root in Germany. And so a democratic Germany could be both united and be strong and not pose a threat to its neighbors.
If I can follow up with a couple of comments. Actually, I was in Germany, in Hamburg, at Max Planck Institute in the day of unification. It was a great event for German people. I was concerned about the economic effects of something what is happening. I have to say that my German colleagues were not aware what would be the cost of unification. They were so self-confident that, well, Germany can do it, and obviously it happened, but at the enormous cost. The chicken, which was swallowed by the snake, as someone made comments in Washington Post recently, was not easily digestible. And in December of 1990, I traveled to Poland, and it was the moment when Wałęsa was, shortly before my visit, was elected a president of Poland. Wałęsa was a leader of Solidarity movement, and I wondered what will be the reaction of Poles to unification of Germany. I believe that it was very positive reaction. Actually, the relief that people from East Germany may go freely, and that some ideas of democracy and freedom can be brought to East Germans, who probably suffered even more than the other satellite countries of the Soviet Union. There were concerns. We all know that the end of the Second World War changed the boundaries of the states, including Poland and Germany. The Soviet Union decided to keep some part of eastern Poland within the borders of the Soviet Union, and they decided, actually with not that quiet support of Western countries, that the old territories which once belonged to Poland, sometimes were taken over by Germany, will now be like Silesia or Gdańsk, will be within the Polish border. There was a lot of concerns that, now free and powerful Germany may claim back these lands. And actually there was, until this moment we see some concerns and problems. It does not mean that they resulted in conflicts, but there are disputes, and there are groups in Germany who would like to see this process reversed. So I would say, yes, there was a positive reaction. There were many concerns which are until now.
I would also just, I had forgotten to add that two of the most important institutions in ensuring that Germany was a part of a Europe that was whole and free were NATO and the EU, which acted both to sort of constrain any revanchism ambitions, as well as to tie the future of Germany to a greater goal of an ever unifying Europe, both politically and militarily through the NATO alliance, and binding Germany closely to the United States and Canada as European allies, as well as to the economic and now political institutions of the European Union. The European Union would not exist without German and French leadership, and that's why we and our European allies so strongly supported
both NATO and EU expansion to the countries of the former Warsaw Pact and other European countries.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
I am probably one of the few that was born a long time before the wall collapsed. And I would like to point out two things. Number one, I live in this country 42 years. The first 20 years, I did not believe that communistic system would collapse. I was not the only one. I think most of the people, East and West, did not believe that communistic system could collapse. It was sudden, and it was unexpected in a sense. The second thing I would like to point out, how successful integration and changes of the system in Eastern and Central Europe was established. That was done by people that did not have any experience because they grew up in communistic system. And they did it mostly right. And I think we should remember them as those who actually implemented what was started by the war. Second point I would like to make to the gentleman about democracy. I do not think democracy could be established by force. From my point of view, democracy is a compromise. It's a system that nobody could have power. It is in our nature as humans to demand, I want to have a full power. I know because I am mad. Democracy is a compromise because I cannot have a full power. You are not going to have it either. And we have to live with each other. This is something that society has to learn, that society has to develop understanding that democracy cannot be imposed by external force and by power. Thank you.
Well, I hope that my comments didn't lead one to think that I thought that we could force democracy on folks, because I do believe Afghanistan, Iraq, and others have shown how difficult that can be. But I too believe that it is, as Peter pointed out, the best form of government that there is available, and the ways in which we can buttress that, I think, is a worthwhile goal of U.S. foreign policy. But I agree with you completely.
Maybe one quick comment about successes of the countries which we call now new democracies in East Central Europe. I believe that I agree with your comment that the progress came very quickly, and that some of the leaders of these countries just started from nothing, without any knowledge of what really democracy means. Probably Poland was different because it had a long history of and long democratic traditions, but other countries did not know a lot. And they tried to borrow from the West, borrow a lot. They turned to us when they were drafting their constitutions and they were sending delegations. We helped them to do the work. And I believe there were a number of problems and obstacles in this process when we wanted to teach lessons. They were not ready to accept lessons. They were ready to accept advice and help, but not lessons. And on the one hand, they did not know too much. I remember the groups of people coming from Eastern Europe and asking us to talk about some market mechanisms and components of market economy, and we were telling them something about securities, and they said, no, we are now secure. They did not know what securities really are. Well, on the other hand, I believe that we were sometimes too eager to teach. Americans believe that a lot of components of our legal and political system which we created are the best in the world. we tried to convince the people coming here that everything what we do, including our democracy, which is great, and our democratic traditions, but it is best for everybody and applicable to all our systems and circumstances. It was not true. If we would ask the question, maybe it is for different discussion, if we would ask the question how many American institutions were borrowed and adopted in these new democracies, well, we do not see that many. We advise them to follow and to adopt our models of judicial review. Do we have any of these countries? They adopted German models, but not American. We suggested them to review the concept of presidential elections, or elections, generally speaking, to the parliaments. They were listening, but do we have any electoral colleges in these countries? And they have even semi-presidential systems like in former Soviet countries. Well, not too many examples of adoption of our models were left. Thank you so much.
If I could comment on that as well, I think IFAS in general definitely does not, and it's a phrase that's used to believe there's a blueprint for democracy. I think that the work in which we do is very focused on working within the political and cultural context of the countries in which we work. And I too, the U.S. system that has gerrymandered election districts and political finance laws that are interesting to say the least, and several things that make the system unique to the American experience is not one in which we profess around the world at all. And I think that does take, you have to take into context the political and cultural context in which we're working. And I think IFAS does a very fine job at that. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't coming across as if we were promoting the American system around the world, because we are not.
I think our time has run out. Let me turn the program over to Professor Litvakowski to thank our speakers and wrap things up.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Dean Darby. And thank you to our distinguished panelists. I believe it is one of the events we organize every single semester and year. And thanks for excellent contributions. And I believe all of us enjoyed the comments and discussion. And thank you so much. We will have a little bit of opportunity to talk to our panelists in a little bit more personal way. We have reception set up in atrium, so let me invite all of you to follow. Thank you very much. I enjoyed very much your class. Yes, thank you. Great.